Paradise, Shangri-La, the Garden of Eden, all creations of the human imagination where life is perfect, with basic needs satisfied and the true spirit of peace assured. But need it only be a fiction? Utopia, ahead on Wide Angle. Merriam-Webster defines the word utopia in two ways. First, as a place of ideal perfection, especially in laws, government, and social conditions. And second, as an impractical scheme for social improvement. While my guest today has no doubt received his share of jibes poking at his impracticality, he has spent much of his professional life collecting data and building a framework for a utopia of the first definition. Joining me to discuss such a better society is Professor Martin Schoenhals, an anthropologist and traveling faculty member of the School for International Training. He has previously taught at Columbia, Johns Hopkins, and the University of Pennsylvania, and is the author of 3 books, most recently, Work, Love, and Learning in Utopia, Equality Reimagined, the basis of our conversation today. Welcome to Wide Angle, Professor Schoenhals.
Thank you. Thank you, Peter.
A pleasure. As I was sort of scratching my head to think about where do we begin a conversation that is so wide-ranging, that is so unique, as to likely require more time than we have today to really delve into it, I hope at least that we will offer the basic kernels, the basic ideas of your work around utopia, and invite people to look more and inquire more on their own. But it struck me that perhaps as good a place as any to start is with a counterpoint, that might illustrate what our two societies hold to be of value. On the one hand, U.S. society, a consumer-driven society that tends to measure value in terms of dollars, in terms of gross national product. On the other hand, the utopia that you're writing about in your book, where the basic units of measure are quite different. You establish them as joy and pleasure. Why such drastically different metrics?
Well, that's a really good question. Yeah. Joy and pleasure, like utopia, they have, for some people, negative connotations. But that's unfortunate because if we look at evolution, biological evolution, joy and pleasure evolved in order to reinforce certain adaptive behaviors. And in humans, it goes even beyond that. For humans, joy and pleasure reinforce behavior that's helpful to other humans. Humans are the only species, along with perhaps chimpanzees and elephants, to have the ability to feel compassion. So when we do something helpful to someone else, we are helping them, but we also feel the compassion that enables us to feel good about helping someone else. So in fact, what that means is that joy and pleasure are not kind of new and novel and unusual sorts of metrics, but they're evolutionary based and far, far, far more ancient than money and GDP. I like to say that pleasure is not, in my utopia, something that's just self-indulgence, because pleasure is encouraging behavior that redounds both to oneself and to others' well-being as well. And therefore, in that sense, pleasure and joy are keys to the connectedness between people that we all so crave. And that's why they're the supreme metric in utopia.
Right. The flip side, I suppose, of joy and pleasure is hierarchy, which you also introduce in your book. Your research suggests that hierarchy is the most confounding of arrangements for human happiness, in fact. Hierarchy being the ranking of people and groups based on status or authority. I can imagine viewers, however, thinking, yeah, hierarchy, it's frequently unfair, it's often arbitrary, and yet aren't we humans sort of hardwired for hierarchy? You say no. Why? What leads you to that conclusion?
Okay, well, that is a question when I teach in New York especially. I like to ask my students if they think that hierarchy and selfishness are somehow hardwired into humans. Mm-hmm. And of course, those of us who've been riding the subway in New York or the trains are likely to say yes immediately. Mm-hmm. But the answer from anthropological research, and I'm an anthropologist, right, is that hierarchy is not hardwired. Hierarchy is not something that stretches back, but just the opposite. Huh. So let me give a few dates to clarify that. Sure. As a species, humans evolved about 200,000 years ago. Mm-hmm. And when we evolved, one of the things that made us survive was our ability to cooperate with mm-hmm. each other, mm-hmm. to live in relatively small groups, 30 to 100 individuals, mm-hmm. Who shared everything of value with each other. So what that means is we were foragers at that time. We went gathering vegetables, we went gathering nuts, we went hunting, mm-hmm. and especially if some large animal was caught, foraging people are extremely careful to apportion the meat absolutely equally to all families. Mm-hmm. And if they don't, the person who's doing the apportioning is subject to a huge, huge amount of pressure. Mm-hmm. In addition, in foraging peoples, there is also a strong, strong stigma attached to anyone who tries to put himself or herself above other people. Mm. So the chief, actually, or the leader of a foraging group of people has to be someone who's humble, self-deprecating, and not arrogant.
Wow.
And so this is going back 200,000 years, and we lived that way until roughly 12,000 years ago, with the origins of agriculture. Okay. Agriculture being a different way of getting our food. Right. We're all used to the idea of farming, and it seems bucolic and pleasant, but in fact it introduces some odious kinds of phenomena, mm-hmm. One of them being ownership of property, land, ownership of animals, right. and warfare. And so at about 6,000 years ago, we have the evolution of, or the origins of, the first states or civilization or hierarchy. Civilization is a misleading word in many ways to those of us who are cultural anthropologists, because it suggests that everything was peaceful and good. And in fact, in the first civilizations, there was hierarchy, and there were people who were conquered by other peoples and enslaved. And so slavery became the first form of hierarchy. Right. But the bottom line behind all of this is to say that for 95% of human existence on the earth, we have lived as cooperative, sharing people. Right. We survived because of this. And while I'm not suggesting that we return to a foraging mm-hmm. way of life, what that does suggest is that we are extremely capable of being sharing and egalitarian.
Right, right. Okay. I guess I wanted you to be able to unpack that notion because of hierarchy, because it is so central to your thinking. I do, however, want to loop back to the notions of joy and pleasure, and who amongst us, particularly these days, wouldn't. If joy and pleasure are the measures, I guess human activity from cradle to grave needs to be reconsidered, and certainly that's one of the undertakings of your book. I suppose a logical place to start would be with our children, and at least in this culture, with schooling. You certainly applaud the establishment of universal education, specifically for its democratic potential, and yet you argue that it has had a number of negative consequences as well. So if you would, perhaps help us see what those negative consequences are, and maybe alongside place what you think learning and education in Utopia should look like.
So I like to look at beginnings, and in this case, rather than going back in history, I want to go back to looking at us at the earlier part of our lifespan. If you look at any of us, looks at a baby or a young child, we see how joyful it is for them to learn. Mm-hmm. And how much curiosity drives them. And we as humans, in addition to surviving because of our ability to cooperate, of course, have survived because of our ability to learn, and also the pleasure that we take in learning. Mm-hmm. What happens, of course, and I don't think I need to convince too many people of this, is that school for so many people confounds that kind of pleasure. And interferes with it. The grades, the testing, the anxiety produced for so many individuals turns what is a naturally enjoyable process into something that becomes very unnatural, right, and lacking in joy, and just the opposite, of course, for some people. It's a real terror. And one of the reasons that's true is because school, the way that it has historically originated in most of the world, starting in the US and also in Prussia, is that school has been connected to getting a job. So it's a means to an end rather than something that has an intrinsic purpose in and of itself. And for me, whenever something becomes a means to an end, that's a way to devalue it.
I guess that sets us up, however, or maybe not however, but also, if our children are taught, are socialized to believe that learning should be a joyful activity, then they become adults who believe that what they engage their lives and their time with, I'll call it, for the moment anyway, I'll call it work, but you maybe will call it something else for us. They may become adults who expect work to be joyful as well. So they're not necessarily doing what it is that many adults currently are doing and occupying their time with. Yeah. What does an adult do in Utopia? How is it qualitatively different than the way you and I and others spend our lives today?
So if you think about what it is that makes work in the first place, is often the element of coercion. It's something that we have to do in order to make a living. And you can kind of play a mind game with yourself to convince yourself of that by taking anything that you really like to do and imagining that someone, for example, in my case, I like to tell students, you know, if you like to go to the movies, I'm going to require that as an assignment for you over the weekend. And of course, the minute that it becomes an assignment, the minute that it's compulsory, all of the joy and pleasure can be taken from it.
Right.
And so the point here is that my idea for what adults do is not to absolve them of work in the sense of creative activity. They still will do creative activity.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, the goal of the economy in Utopia will be, in a way that I flesh out in the book, to provide the resources for people to do creative endeavors that are consistent with what their joys and their abilities are.
Mm-hmm.
The one difference is that it will not be compulsory work.
Mm-hmm.
And there's no reason that work has to be compulsory. The world has enough food to feed all of us. The world has enough to provide all of us with basic subsistence.
Mm-hmm.
And so in Utopia, that will be something that happens for all people, will be provided with that basic subsistence, so that we work because we want to, not because we have to.
Right. And we'll get into that a little bit more in our second half. We'll take a break here, Martin, and ask viewers to join us on the other side, where we'll explore money, compassion, and the end of the nation state.
We'd love to hear your feedback. Email us at wideangle@acmi.tv. For information about this episode or to view other Wide Angle episodes, visit us online at acmi.tv/wideangle.
Welcome back to Wide Angle. I'm Peter Bermudez, speaking today with Professor Martin Schoenhals about Utopia and his book, Work, Love, and Learning in Utopia, Equality Reimagined. I'd like to ask you to speak to a couple features that you imagine would stop, or at least cease perhaps, the development of a wealth gap, certainly a hierarchy, similar to the one that we're frustrated with today. Yeah, the largest since the Gilded Age 100 years ago. In particular, I'm talking about Utopia's guarantee of basic necessities, food, shelter, healthcare, amongst others, and the disappearance of money, at least as we've become familiar with it. Significant recommendations, seismic ramifications, of course, as well. If you could, please flesh those ideas out just a little bit for us, because, of course, they're very different than our current reality.
Yes.
Yeah.
Indeed, they are different from our current reality, although not quite as different as we might imagine. So let me take the idea of a basic guarantee
Sure.
to all people of enough to eat, enough sufficient housing, clothing, healthcare,
Right.
and so on. So if you think of that issue, one of the things that people always say to me, especially Americans, is, but how can we guarantee things to people, then they won't work? Mm-hmm. That idleness will result, and idleness itself, especially in the American puritanical conception, is odious. But think about children for a minute. Children also worked in the past, up until the 20th century, until the Great Depression, when work for children was outlawed. Mm-hmm. And yet today, as I travel the world, and as I'm sure most of your listeners will know, the idea of children working is anathema wherever you go, and is outlawed. It doesn't mean that there aren't cases of children working, but we've developed a norm that children should not have to work, and that we don't tie their own subsistence to their ability to work.
Right.
And so if we can do that for children, there's no reason that we can't also do that for all humans, and with a similar humanitarian kind of impulse. Of course, one of the questions people will ask is, if we do that, will people still work? And to think about that question, think about how many things that people do that aren't compensated by your second topic, money.
Right.
Parents don't have to be paid to take care of their children, and yet, although I'm not a parent, I know that it's probably the most difficult job there can be. to raise children. So we don't need to have money in order to do things. So many people throughout the world do acts of volunteerism or voluntary sorts of things. We engage in hobbies. I'm in various kinds of choirs. We sing for no money, and yet we're every bit as committed and frankly, probably every bit as good as those who are professionals. And so my point here is that we don't need to have money in order to guarantee that we work.
All right, and now to what seems to me in this context sort of an abrasive shift, and yet it's one of the other things that you feel central to the development of Utopia. The nation state may well have served as a stepping stone in humanity's journey to self-governance, yeah, but you believe it served its function, its moment is past, and that our continued evolution as individuals, as collective peoples, needs to see the abolition of the nation state, that it's limiting us. Why the end of the nation state? And I suppose what does the governance of Utopia look like?
So the nation state, all we have to do to think about the nation state is to think about the 20th century. World War I, World War II, the Holocaust, all of the various genocides. Scholars who have studied all of those things have indicted the nation state and nationalism. And especially with, for example, something like genocide, most scholars believe that that's a modern phenomenon that comes with the nation state, because the nation state is really the idea that certain people are insiders to a large piece of land that will be guarded by armed forces, and certain people are outsiders. And that's an extremely dangerous kind of sociology, to decide who belongs and who doesn't, and to use force and to use economics and other things to exclude, to punish those who don't belong. So to me, that creation of groups of people who belong and don't belong, and groups that are set up to compete with them, is a really dangerous one. What will replace it? Of course, that's not an easy thing. As we know, the United Nations has great ideals and has done many good things. I've worked there myself, so I know some of the good things that it does. I'm sure many people will come up with difficulties in the United Nations, but the idea that the world can live without warfare is not a fanciful ideal. It's something toward which we should all strive. You know, one person working on this issue has said that we did not have, we have had slavery for most of recorded history, and yet we've now come to the conclusion that slavery is not something that should exist. And so I think the same can happen with warfare. We can get along and negotiate conflicts without warfare, and the warfare connected to the nation state.
Well, regrettably, our time wraps up, Marty. But I'm wondering if there's anything we haven't spoken of today that you feel would be good to leave viewers with, or any sort of final thoughts that you'd like to provide.
Yes, this is kind of circling back to your introduction and your introduction of the two definitions of utopia. I think it's really revealing about a certain pessimism that we all have in modern society, that the word utopia and the concept of utopia is given a negative image as something that's not possible. Humans can imagine, it not only can, but we desire to imagine a better world. It's something that we continually strive for. And I think it's something that we should see as a really good and positive thing. And especially as an academic, as a teacher, as a student too, we do so much talking about the problems of the world and not enough about kind of comprehensive, large-scale visionary ideas of how to solve those problems. And I want to see that change. It's why I wrote the book. It's something that's been a labor of love for me, because I've thought about these issues and believed in the possibility of imagining a better future. And I've done that for most of my life. And I now am glad to be able to share those ideas and invite others into the conversation and the thoughts about utopia.
Exactly. And I should note that at the front of the book is an invitation from you, along with your email address.
Yes.
Wherein you'd like to expand the conversation and invite interested viewers to have that dialogue with you and grow ideas from there.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, Martin, I certainly thank you for taking the time to join us today. I know this has been a dream of many years, so congratulations on the publication of the book. Thank you for finishing it. Thank you for offering us some big ideas that perhaps have us looking in a different direction than our current media generally has us looking in. Yeah?
And thank you, Peter, for giving me a chance to talk about all of these ideas as well.
A pleasure. The challenges we face today could have been taken straight out of a dystopian novel. Climate change, a widening wealth gap amidst contracting democracies, growing stress, depression, addictions, deepening divisions, intolerance, hatreds. It's frightening and, perhaps more importantly, deflating. So it is at times such as these that we should be especially thankful for voices like those of my guest today. People unafraid of being labeled a utopian in its most pejorative sense, because they aim for its higher meaning, to offer us tools to rekindle hope and create a new foundation that might offer us a path to joy and the possibility of equality. So let's build on our expectations for humanity's best, as naive as it may be, rather than our fears of its worst. On behalf of Professor Martin Schoenhals, I'm Peter Bermudez. Thank you for joining us for this edition of Wide Angle.